Re-Animator was one of the most unlikely films to ever be made, let alone become an insanely popular horror classic. Based on a short story by H.P. Lovecraft, it came to life thanks to a controversial Chicago theater director and a fresh new Re-Animator in 1985, Stuart Gordon had an entire other career as a director of controversial and groundbreaking theater in Chicago. He was the first person to stage David Mamet's Sexual Perversity in Chicago in 1974, the play that established Mamet as a powerful new voice in writing. He and his wife Carolyn Purdy co-wrote a play called ER that was even turned into a short-lived TV series. He'd worked with playwright Dennis Paoli a handful of times by then, so when Gordon had the idea to turn the Lovecraft story Herbert West Re-Animator into a stage play, he teamed with Paoli to bring it to life. The idea of a stage play turned into a 13-episode TV series, and then its final version as a feature film with producer Brian Yuzna. Jeffrey Combs, on the other hand, was just getting started on his career and popping up in small roles in comedies like Honky Tonk Freeway and The Man with Two Brains. His first horror film appearance was in 1983's Frightmare, but it was 2 years later when a horror film would truly change his life. Bold, shocking, hilarious, and with visuals that had never been seen in film before that point, Re-Animator was something new and wild. Perhaps the biggest surprise was the critical acclaim it garnered, with positive reviews from such luminaries as Roger Ebert, Pauline Kael, and Janet Maslin. Critics also noted the performance of Combs and his young co-star and soon-to-be frequent collaborator, Barbara Crampton. Even though the movie is considered a classic now, it only did moderately well at the box office, earning about $2 million. But the people who saw it loved it, and it gained a cult following. The gang got back together 1 year later, with Brian Yuzna producing and co-writing another Lovecraft adaptation with Gordon and Dennis Paoli, which would once again star Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton. From Beyond, with its scientists inventing a way to see the nightmarish reality just beyond normal human perception, retained the gore and comedy of Re-Animator, but upped the ante with brain-warping psychedelia and the likable addition of Dawn of the Dead's Ken Foree. The movie was almost 4 times more expensive than Re-Animator, and because of its wild tone and unusual narrative, it didn't do as well in theaters, earning just over $1 million. Hope for another Lovecraft adaptation from the team didn't look good at the time. Luckily, Gordon had been shooting another horror film simultaneously to From Beyond, and the next year, Dolls was released. Combs did not appear in this film, though Gordon's wife Carolyn Purdy, who had a role in both Re-Animator and From Beyond, did. Meanwhile, Combs was off to the small screen for appearances in popular TV series like Beauty and the Beast and Jake and the Fat Man. But Combs' next feature film appearance would be the beginning of a series of new collaborations for him and Gordon. Combs appeared in Cellar Dweller, a fantastically named horror film written by Child's Play creator Don Mancini and produced by world-famous low-budget producer Charles Band. Band, known for his Full Moon output, was also the producer on Gordon's just-released Dolls. Fortune smiled, and Band reunited with Combs and Gordon for Robot Jocks. It was a small but memorable role for Combs in a film that played off an upsurge of interest in giant robots after the popularity of shows like Robotech, Voltron, and Mobile Suit Gundam. The movie was expensive for Band, somewhere between $6 to $10 million, and it did poorly at the box office and with critics. Looking back, it is an enjoyable relic of its era, with surprisingly good practical effects, given its budget. Recovering from the devastating reception for Robot Jocks, Gordon went to the safety of television and got back to basics with Daughter of Darkness, a TV movie starring Anthony Perkins in one of his last performances 2 years before his death. Combs, on the other hand, retreated back into familiar territory with producer Brian Yuzna to make Bride of Re-Animator. The film's inspiration was clear from the title, and the darkly comic tone was still intact. Gordon's most interesting detour at that time was when he and Brian Yuzna signed on to direct and produce Honey, I Shrunk the Kids for Disney. He ultimately had to step away from directing for health reasons, but he and Yuzna still have story credit on the film. But a famed horror author from years past would bring the team of Gordon and Combs together again. This time, the author was Edgar Allan Poe, and the story was The Pit and the Pendulum. Producer Charles Band, being a newer version of Roger Corman for the straight-to-video era, emulated Corman by producing this Poe adaptation. Combs was surrounded by impressive performers like Oliver Reed and Lance Henriksen, and Gordon created an exciting period epic with adventure and swordplay. Why they decided to make Combs look like Velma from Scooby-Doo, not quite sure. Combs would appear in several more banned films over the next few years, including Trancers 2 and Dr. Mordred, which is basically Doctor Strange, but no one wanted to pay for the licensing rights, before he teamed back up with Gordon and ventured back into the future for Fortress. Take a classic futuristic prison premise, sprinkle it with a helping of overpopulation paranoia, and add genre stalwarts like Christopher Lambert and Kurtwood Smith, and you have the makings of a fun dystopian sci-fi actioner. Gordon does a lot visually with his contained premise, and Combs is having a blast, pun intended, as D-Day, a fellow prisoner clearly inspired by Dennis Hopper's performance in Apocalypse Now. It would be 3 years before Gordon directed another film, but in that time, Combs would appear in several movies and TV shows, including returning to the world of Lovecraft to actually play Lovecraft himself in the anthology film Necronomicon, Book of the Dead. Then, in 1995, the stars aligned again, and everyone reunited. Castle Freak is a darker and more serious film than Gordon's other Lovecraft adaptations, and its tone and effects are all the more impressive given it was made for almost half the budget of Re-Animator from a decade earlier. Hard to believe, the film started its life as a poster for which Charles Band had no actual story beyond the fact that there would be a castle and there would also be a freak. It would be a decade before Gordon and Combs would work together again, and in the meantime, their careers would vary wildly. Gordon broke out of horror and stretched his career into new and exciting places. He worked with Crampton again in the goofy sci-fi adventure Space Truckers, which is exactly what you think it is. He also went back to the Lovecraft well one more time with Dennis Paoli to explore the aquatic menace of Dagon in 2001, an adaptation that captures Lovecraft's vibe perfectly. Combs would appear in none of those films over the decade, and it's not because they had a falling out, it's because Combs was busy. New Zealand filmmaker Peter Jackson, not yet famous for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, cast Combs as the delightfully creepy FBI agent Milton Dammers in the horror comedy The Frighteners. Combs absolutely walked away with the film, the most memorable character in a movie filled with interesting characters. That film opened a lot of doors for Combs, who started popping up everywhere from I Still Know What You Did Last Summer to the trilogy capping Beyond Re-Animator to the big-budget remake of House on Haunted Hill. His star was on the rise. Returning to a collaboration from very early in his career, Gordon decided to make a filmic adaptation of one of David Mamet's most dark and troubling plays. Edmund, starring William H. Macy as a struggling everyman lost on an overnight odyssey in New York City, is as close as Mamet ever got to writing a true horror story, and Gordon pushes it over the edge with his unflinching eye for the brutality of the tale. Though Combs is only on screen for a couple of minutes as the hotel desk clerk, he is clearly having a good time in this seedy but darkly humorous film. Gordon's and Combs' next collaboration would be tricky. 2007's Stuck is a short, brutal, contained thriller with only 3 major characters. Gordon casts Stephen Ray as the beleaguered male lead, with Mina Suvari and Russell Hornsby as the couple who have to figure out how to deal with the almost dead man laying in their garage. So where does Combs fit into this tightly plotted, tiny little movie? Listen closely to the voice of the 911 operator. There was another exciting collaboration for Combs and Gordon in 2007, one brought about by producer Mick Garris on his Showtime anthology series Masters of Horror. Gordon and Combs only ever worked on one previous Poe adaptation, The Pit and the Pendulum, but the story of Poe spoke to both of them, as well as Dennis Paoli. So in 2007, they created a stylized blending of fiction and history to explore Poe's writing experiences in the episode The Black Cat. The script and direction were top-notch, but it was Combs' stunning performance as the tortured author that made the episode a standout even amongst other amazing works. 2007 was the last screen pairing of Combs and Gordon. They both continued to work, of course. Gordon made one of the most exciting and shocking episodes of the Masters of Horror spin-off series Fear Itself, a tale called Eater, starring a young Elizabeth Moss. And Jeffrey Combs has worked nearly non-stop in film and television, with a voiceover resume of shocking length and variety, from Scooby-Doo and the Avengers to Transformers. He even lent his voice to a portrayal of adult H.P. Lovecraft in 2018's animated movie Howard Lovecraft and the Kingdom of Madness. All great work, but to this day, they didn't make another movie together. But the big screen isn't the only place they collaborated. Gordon comes from the theater, and later in his career, he decided to return to it. He even made Re-Animator the musical in 2011 with frequent co-writer Dennis Paoli, and he would team with Combs again for another stage performance. A far cry from the splashy musical extravaganza of Re-Animator the musical, the final teaming of Combs and Gordon would be a small, intimate, revelatory experience. After getting inside the head of Edgar Allan Poe so effectively for their episode of Masters of Horror, COMBS felt there was more to be explored in the life and stories of the troubled but brilliant author. COMBS recruited Paoli one more time to help him create a one-man show called Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe. Directed by Gordon for its initial run, the play was a tour de force that showed every shade of Combs' brilliance as well as Poe's. And so their careers came full circle, with the controversial theater director and the neophyte actor finding themselves back on the stage, inspired by a long-dead author whose horror writing had made him immortal. With the unfortunate loss of Stuart Gordon just recently, it means that there will be no more new collaborations between them. But we'll always have the cherished work the two did together. Not to mention Gordon's team-ups with Dennis Paoli, Barbara Crampton, Carolyn Purdy, Charles Band, David Mamet, and Brian Yuzna. Gordon's legacy will live on long after him, just like some of the characters in his stories who refuse to remain dead. That's it for this episode of Deadly Duos. Join us again next time for another fantastic scare pair.
Of course he's dead. The dosage was too large.
You killed him.
No, I did not. I gave him life.